Hey, welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be looking at my freshly completed pedal board build centered around dual ToneX pedals from IK Multimedia. That's right, two ToneX pedals in glorious stereo. This video is actually the last video in an 8-part series where I talk about how I built this board. So if you're interested in soldering or what specific parts I used or some of the other specifics of this project, you can check out those videos as well. But this video is going to let you finally hear it and see it all finished. Quick disclaimer to say I'm not paid to do this video. No one gave me anything. I purchased all this myself and I use it because I love it. Now, this is going to be a fairly detailed video, so if you're just here for the sounds, just feel free to jump ahead, use the chapter markers down there, skip around, okay? But if you're in this for the full overview, I salute you. Stay right here. We're gonna dive in just a second. Now, inevitably, as much as I dig this board right now, there will be changes I make to it in the future, so if there's anything that I tweak that I think you should know about, I'll make another video and link it right here. So let's talk about why I built this board. I know there are a lot of you, at least at the time this video was released, that are really curious about the ToneX pedals and are considering incorporating them in your rig. Or maybe you have one ToneX pedal already, but are considering adding a second one for a true stereo experience, which would give you the ability to run two separate but complementary amps and or run your stereo wet effects in front of your amps, which is my personal preference and the biggest reason why I ended up buying two of these. I'll just get right to it. These ToneX pedals are what caused me to completely redesign my old board into what it is now. I'd been trying to build a stereo hybrid modeling rig for quite some time. I've tried the Kingsley Squire paired with a 2-notes torpedo cab. I've tried a Kemper, tried an ACS1, I've done dual Iridiums, I've done the Ruby and Dream combo, done the HX Stomp, even tried using a quad Cortex for just my amp captures. And let me just say that the dual ToneX pedals have finally been able to give me the tone that I struggled to find with all of those other options. As good as they are, and those other options really are good, believe me when I say that, you can get amazing tones from all those options. But for me, so far in my journey, I've found the ToneX pedals to be the most realistic amp-in-a-box pedals I've ever tried. So that's why I wanted to build a board that had these at the center. All that to say, at least at the moment, having tried basically everything else out there, I really do think these are the best you can get as far as accurate amp capturing is concerned. That is, if you want to put together a hybrid rig and use analog pedals. Now, if you're just looking for the best all-in-one modeler out there, Fractal, in my opinion, is the GOAT, but that's for a different video. But in my view, as far as capture tech that can actually fit on a pedal board right now, ToneX is king. Let's talk about the foundation. The pedal board I'm using is a Temple Audio Trio 28 with the Goodwood Audio Lift 21-inch riser. Let me just say a quick word on the Temple Audio boards because I know they're a bit polarizing out there. Yes, when you load these boards with this many pedals, there's a bit of a flex to it. It's certainly not as sturdy as some other boards on the market, but the modular side panels are amazing and I use the heck out of them, as you'll see. I also love that I can fit so many things under the board and somehow it still doesn't feel like a tall board to me. I can still keep my heel on the ground and access all of my front row switches. I will say if I were a touring artist who traveled a lot, I don't think I would choose this board just because of the sturdiness of it, but if you either have less pedals or have a smaller size board, then I think you could get away with it. And for those like me who mostly play at church and the occasional local camp or conference, this board is great. So let's talk about the signal chain. The guitar plugs into the input jack on the side, which goes immediately into the JHS Buffered Splitter. And one of the outputs on the splitter goes back to an output jack on the side of the board for reamping. Now I know some of you do it differently, but I prefer to reamp with a completely dry and clean guitar signal. Then the other output goes to the first pedal in my chain, which is a Cali 76 compressor. From the compressor, it goes into the POG 2, and then from the POG 2 goes into the input of my RJM PBC 6X. Now, the part of the reason why the compressor and the POG sit outside of my switcher is 1, because I never turn off my compressor, and 2, because my POG is MIDI modded. So I can turn the POG on and off and control all the presets within the PBC, so it doesn't have to live within a loop. The PBC6X has 3 mono loops, 3 stereo loops, plus a stereo insert loop. And because all the stereo loops are capable of converting to dual mono loops, the switcher can be configured for 11 mono loops if you want. I've been using the switcher for a handful of years now, and its capabilities still blow me away. I can't recommend it enough. I'll probably make a video on just how I'm using this alone, but once you get your head around it, it's amazing. So here's how I have mine configured. Loop 1 is the Benson Preamp, Loop 2 is the Klon KTR, Loop 3 is the Snobletone Daily Driver, Loop 4 is stereo, but I converted it to dual mono, and so one loop is going to the JHS Kilt, and the other is going to the Great Eastern Effects Focus Fuzz. Now, you got to remember the order of the loops doesn't matter, because this is a matrix switcher, which allows you to reorder any of the loops for any preset you make, which is pretty great. And I should mention, even though my Benson Preamp is in loop 1, it's not my first stage drive. My first stage drive is the Daily Driver, the Benson Preamp is my second, and the Kilt is the third stage. More on that later, but back to the signal chain. So after the overdrives, next in my chain is my insert loop, which is stereo, but I configured it to dual mono with 1 mono loop connected to my Walrus Slötva, and the other loop connected to a handful of things that are always on. So for the always on loop, this first goes to a custom Audition junction on the side of my board that allows me to plug in a mono pedal to try out if I want to. And I also routed auxiliary power to the side of the board, so it's easy to power the pedal I'm auditioning. Now, out of the audition loop, it goes into my Benson Germanium boost right here, which I wanted to sit outside of the main loops and after my overdrives so I can engage it on a whim. Now, that stacks really well with every overdrive on my board, and it gives me like this subtle volume boost with a little added crunch from the amp captures that are being hit harder. Now, from the boost goes into a rehoused Chase Tone secret preamp, which I leave always on, and just provides a tiny bit of color and dimension to my tone. But while I was rehousing it, I wired up another DC power jack on the side so that if I wanted to audition a pedal at the very beginning of my chain on the right side of my board, like a compressor, a fuzz, or the Digitech drop, I'd have easy access to power right there. So back to the signal chain, out of the secret preamp, it goes to the volume pedal, and then from the volume pedal back into the PBC. Now, the tuner, by the way, I should mention, is actually connected to input 2 on the PBC, which you're able to configure to become a dedicated tuner output, which is really convenient. Then loop 5 is my first true stereo loop, and that loop connects to the HX Stomp, which I'm not using for amps, obviously. I'm just using that for auxiliary effects, which I'll demonstrate in a bit. Then from the HX Stomp goes into the Mobius, and then the Timeline, and Big Sky. And then at the end of the chain, loop 6 is stereo and is connected to the dual ToneX pedals. Now I wanted to put both my wet effects and the ToneX pedals in loops of their own so that I could decide per preset whether I wanted the wet effects to come before or after the ToneX pedals. But I'll be honest, 99% of the time I actually prefer my wet effects in front of the amps, and so that's typically how I'm running it. I do have the expression pedal jack on the PBC routed to a jack on the side of my board just in case I want to use an expression pedal with any of my MIDI effects. I'm also using a Pedalnetics aux2 external switch designed for the PBC6X, and so I can bank up and down. Same with my HX Stomp, by the way. And I just want to give a shout out to Jason over at Pedalnetics. Jason's a great guy. He's super responsive, very personable and creative, and willing to work with you on whatever kind of auxiliary switch you need. If you need a switch like this for any of your pedals, go check him out. Now lastly, on the PBC, I'm using the function jack to be able to remotely control the red mode on my JHS Kilt for kind of a 4th stage drive if I need it. The cool thing is this jack is stereo also, so if I had 2 JHS pedals with the red remote option, like a Morning Glory or Superbolt or something like that, I could control each one independently with this function jack. Again, RJM stuff is absolutely amazing. Now out of the PBC goes stereo into the Pinstripes Pedals Daiso Plus with the optional polarity reverse switch in case I choose a couple amp captures that are out of polarity with each other. I can just flip that switch. So then out of the Daiso to a couple of XLR jacks on the side of my board, which can connect directly to front of house or my recording interface. I'll also mention that I have the through outputs on the Daiso routed to the side of my board as well, so that if I wanted to just bypass the ToneX pedals and connect this board directly to an amp, I could do that also. Now let's talk a bit more about what's under the hood. For starters, I know it's not the neatest, cleanest routing job in the world, but to be honest, there's no way I'm going to keep the exact same pedals on my board for more than a year, right? And the times that I have gone overboard with neat wiring, I've hated myself the minute I wanted to swap a pedal. So sincerely, I intentionally routed my cables in a way that I could just more easily swap things around when the time comes. And so instead of zip ties and really clean lines, I just use Velcro one wrap, which makes it super easy to undo and redo. Then I don't worry about getting everything perfectly in order. The only thing I try my best to do, and I can't always do it, is to keep the instrument cables away from the power cables, at least the high voltage cables. And if they have to cross, I try to make them cross perpendicularly and not parallel to each other, since evidently that helps with noise. I'm not an electrician, but that's what I've been told. All right, now that that's out of the way, for power, I'm using 2 Strymon Zumas and a Strymon Ojai, and also a Crux that's dedicated to power my HX Stomp. For my MIDI routing, I'm using a product from RJM called the Multibox. It's brand new. This thing can be configured in a number of different ways, and it turns out it can do something I've been looking for a long time, actually. So let me go on, hopefully, an interesting and helpful tangent for a sec. For those of you with Strymon's big box pedals and have ever used Strymon's Nixie editor before, you know you typically had to buy a special MIDI to USB cable to connect to Nixie. But the problem is that you'd have to disconnect your MIDI chain while you use the editor, and this kind of disrupts the workflow of building song presets, in my opinion. So I'd been trying to find a way to have my PBC act as the MIDI to USB interface, which in theory would allow me to have the Mastermind editor open and at the same time have Nixie open with just one USB cable connected to my computer. It turns out that the Strymon pedals are a bit sensitive and picky about what interface it wants to work with. But Ron from RJM was kind enough to help me with this. So here's what I'm doing with the Multibox that has allowed this to work. I have a MIDI cable coming out of the PBC into the Multibox input, we'll call that 1. Then out of the Multibox, 2, into the Stryfecta. Then out of the Stryfecta, back into the Multibox, we'll call that 4. So essentially, the Strymon pedals have their own loop that comes in and out of the Multibox. Now this is how the Strymon pedals need to be connected in order for Nixie to work. For some reason, they need to be in their own dedicated loop with no other MIDI pedals connected in the chain, and the Multibox can handle that. Thankfully though, the Multibox has another MIDI output that I was able to connect to my POG, then the ToneX pedals, and lastly the HX Stomp. So all of this paired with a passive USB hub that's connected to the PBC, the HX Stomp, and one of my ToneX pedals is connected to a USB jack on the side of my board, which allows me to connect one USB cable from my board to my computer and be able to pull up and edit the Mastermind software, Strymon Nixie, HX Edit, and the ToneX software all at the same time. And I can keep editing presets and manipulating the PBC all at the same time without disconnecting anything. Now, because I have 2 ToneX pedals, I still had to route another USB cable to connect that pedal, and they can't be connected at the same time or else the software wouldn't know which pedal to connect to. But I often don't need the ToneX software open when I'm editing presets, since I just load some tone models that I like and go, okay? Now this is rad, right? I unfortunately have to pause here and let you know this almost all works flawlessly. There are still 2 little bugs that I haven't been able to work out yet, and if I do end up finding solutions, I'll make videos about it. I don't want to waste time going into the details of the bugs, but essentially there's an issue the ToneX pedals have with passing MIDI data downstream. But I figured out the bug only happens when a USB cable is plugged in. So when I'm playing live and no USB cable is plugged into the side of my board, everything functions fine. It's only when I'm editing things and making presets that I have an issue. The next little glitch is that I do still have some issues with Strymon Nixie. It does for the most part work, but it occasionally has issues writing to the pedals. So I can tweak a preset in Nixie, but then when I hit the write button, it takes a while and sometimes doesn't write everything correctly. So the workaround that I found for this is that I can edit the preset on Nixie on my computer, but then when it comes time to save that preset, I just reach down and just have to save it like on the pedal itself. Not a huge problem and still a much better way than the old way of doing it, but still not perfect. Now, I do need to say here that Ron from RJM has spent a lot of time helping me troubleshoot, and I really, really appreciate that. And it also needs to be said that he does not have the same issues that I do. So my issues may be connected to something unique that I have going on with my board. Bottom line, it's not the multi-box's fault. So if you're looking for a really flexible MIDI breakout box, you should definitely check out the RJM multi-box. But all in all, the ability to edit most everything from my desk has been so helpful and so much faster of a workflow than before. Just a few last things before we hear some tones, all right? On the left side of the board, I have some future plans to possibly install MIDI in and MIDI out jacks in case I wanted to make multi-tracks playback control my presets for me, perhaps, but that's down the road. But I did install a stereo headphone jack that's connected to the headphone outputs on the ToneX pedals in case I need to practice quietly somewhere. And then lastly, I use PowerCon power jacks, and I have it wired to both sides of my board in case I'm positioned differently on the stage. Lastly, I had to find people at Creation Music Company make me a custom case for this, which is right here, and I made its own video for it. So if you want to check that out, go for it. But it was essential to have a custom case made since this thing is pretty big and the second tier is kind of tricky. But they did a great job and the case holds all of this super well. All right, so if you made it through all of the detailed stuff, congratulations. And if you just skipped all that and are here for the tones, that's great too. So let's get into it. But first things first, I need to talk about the foundation of my tone, which is primarily the guitar, the amp captures themselves, and then the compressor, which I leave on all the time, and finally the secret preamp, which I also typically leave on all the time. Those all work together to form the foundation. Just a real quick note on the guitars. The guitars that I'll use today, you'll probably see my own parts caster Strat with Lambertones Cremas, so fairly low output humbuckers there. And I also have an Obsidian wire harness in there so I can split the coils when I really want that thin stratty sound, so you may hear that too. I also have a Squire Mascis Jazzmaster. I've done a few mods on it, but not anything that would change the essential tone of the guitar, so it's pretty much stock. The pickups are stock, the wiring hasn't been touched yet. Stay tuned for more videos on that. The other guitar you'll hear is a Duesenberg Starplayer TV, also totally stock. You may see the Danelectro Baritone in there for a short bit. And then lastly, a PRS Custom 24 loaded with, can I say, Bethel specials? At least that's what David Hislop was running at the time of posting, which is a Fralin modern P.A.F at 8K in the bridge and a pure P.A.F at 7.5K in the neck. For my amp captures, and this is totally subject to change at any time, but lately I've been using Tone Factor's Benson Chimera Breakup 76D on the right side and their AC30 6TB Breakup 76D on the left side. Both totally stock, no EQ tweaks or gain tweaks at all. I do need to note though that I run my input trim at plus 8.5 dB on my ToneX pedals. Now, I feel like these two amps just pair super well together, sound great pushed into overdrive, and can handle wet effects really, really well. You may hear also an early version of my own AC30 that I've captured that I plan on releasing soon, and any other tone models I play through, I'll just make sure to write that on the screen. Now, I'll just say, if you're looking for insanely good captures for praise and worship right now, you should really check out Tone Factor, Worship Tutorials, and Tone Junkie, who are all producing top quality stuff for the ToneX, but do also look out for some of my own captures coming soon. So what I'm looking for in an amp tone is something with just a touch of breakup. You may be hearing this and not hear much breakup at all, but that's because I've yet to add the compressor and the secret preamp. For the compressor, I'm okay with a pretty aggressive compressor sound. So I'm setting the in pretty high, but depending on the guitar, I'll roll this up or down. A guitar with hotter pickups, I'll roll it down a bit. But the ratio, I put the ratio pretty high, the attack pretty slow or long, as the manual says. This is an important one for me. I'm trying to increase the attack time, essentially make it take longer for the pedal to start compressing the note. That way, the very beginning of each note has a percussive quality to it. It's actually louder. So you can really hear the pick striking the string. The transient is loud. I like that sound, especially in palm mute stuff or light ambient moments. I really want to hear the attack. And then the release time, I've really found to be the control on the compressor that does a lot of work. On the Cali 76, turning it to the left increases the release time, essentially making it hold on to your note longer. So the compression has a more pronounced effect when it's turned more to the left. Turn it all the way to the right and it releases very quickly, so you don't hear the compressor working as long and it feels more open. I like the release set around 10 or 11 o'clock, so it's pretty squishy. But then I'll dial in the dry to about noon, so although I'm doing a lot of compression, there's still a parallel dry path to keep a touch of that natural signal in there. The 30,000 foot view of what I really want in a compressor is to make my soft notes louder and to accentuate the attack of my pick. If a compressor can do those things cleanly, then it's a great compressor. And by the way, yes, I'm running this at 18 volts for higher headroom. So back to the core tone. So even now, the tone isn't quite breaking up. It's still really clean. But that's where this rehoused Chase Tone Secret Preamp comes in. I have this set to the mid EQ setting and I adjust the volume to give me just that slight amount of breakup. And again, depending on the guitar, I may mess with the EQ setting and adjust the volume to taste. So let's just really briefly go over my overdrives. My first stage drive is the Schnobeltone Daily Driver, which I actually had Roman mod for me, and he increased the overall output of the pedal, which has helped me use this as a true first gain stage, just that slight breakup quality to it. This pedal, just by nature, just with all knobs at noon, really cuts the bass, which for me helps it cut through the mix, especially if I'm using the neck pickup for lighter moments, and it helps thin out the amp models, which can be a tad muddy on the neck humbucker in particular. But the Daily Driver just adds a little bit of grit and a tiny bit of volume and just has a great EQ to it. For my second stage, I'm using the Benson Preamp, which is set to a much more apparent overdrive sound with a touch more volume than the Daily Driver. With each overdrive stage, I'm trying to increase both gain and volume. Now, unlike the Daily Driver, the Benson is dialed in really warm by default. So I have to cut a ton of bass and boost a ton of treble to get it to kind of match the Daily Driver vibe. But I can get there with room to spare, so it's great. My third gain stage is my JHS Kilt V2, which everyone knows, and it does that thing really well. Now when needed, I can engage the red mode via the PBC, which is nice, but lately I've been finding I really like the sound of the Benson boost with the blue mode more than simply activating the red mode. Now I've been messing around with my board for the past several weeks, and honestly, I haven't found a super solid use for the KTR quite yet, which is surprising because I used to use the KTR as my second stage drive all the time with my Iridium rig, and also when I use the HX Stomp for amps, but for some reason, I'm not finding like a tonal home for it right now. It's kind of a more mid-focus drive that gets, to me, a little too fizzy when you turn the tone up too far, so I feel like it pairs maybe better with single coils, which I don't really have except for the Mascis, which has more like P90s anyway. But the KTR does all right at boosting another overdrive, especially the daily driver, so I'll be messing with that in the season ahead. For the Focus Fuzz, it's a pedal that's super fun and very accessible as far as a fuzz goes. It's more like a really gnarly overdrive. It can just crank out great lead or rhythm tones, and there's really not a bad setting on it. The Focus knob is sort of like a tone control, sort of. The fuzz turns up the drive and the level turns up the level. It's a very simple pedal. Now I gotta be honest and say I don't use it often, but when I do, it's definitely a sound none of my other overdrives can do. So after my main overdrive section, I route my signal in the PBC to go to an always-on loop, which has the audition loop, then the Benson Germanium boost, then the Chase Tone secret preamp. Now, I already showed you the secret preamp earlier, but the Benson boost is something I love having access to on the fly. Like I mentioned, I really like the sound of this stacked with really any of my other drives. It works really well with all of them. So I've been playing with building presets in the PBC that assume I'm going to kick on the boost at certain times. But here's what the boost sounds like with each of my drives. After all that goes to my Layla Volume S, which is just the best volume pedal ever. I had a Hilton Pro Guitar Volume for years and just recently switched to this to save space, but it also just works super, super well too. I like having my volume after my overdrives because when I swell in, I want to hear my fully distorted tones raising in volume. I don't want to have my overdrives start clean and then get progressively dirtier. Some may like that, but that's just not what I chose for this build. And for my tuner, which is actually connected to PBC's input too, but configured to be a tuner output, so it gets just a clean signal, which is great. I chose that Sonic Research Turbo Tuner ST300 Mini, which is the best pedal tuner you can buy. It's definitely more responsive than the Peterson Strobo Stomp HD, and I use it to tune and intonate my guitars, and I love it. But just for fun, look how well it tracks. Now next is my wet section. Like I mentioned earlier, I split the insert loop on the PVC to be dual mono, so one of those loops is always on and the other is connected to the Walrus Audio Slötva. This is a mono reverb pedal that's got a really unique character to it. Now to be honest, I haven't totally dialed it into perfection yet, but one thing I'll use it for is underscoring. I'll use the infinite sustain feature at times to create an ambient bed. How I have my PBC set up is so on any preset I'm on, if I hit a button on my current preset, it takes me to a global preset. And that global preset is a general patch that has some ambient verb, some delay stuff going on, and it also tees up my Mobius and my HX Stomp and my POG so that they're ready to be engaged at any time. Essentially, it sends them a MIDI command but doesn't actually turn them on. And also, back to the Slötva, I have the global preset enable the loop for the Slötva, which I normally keep off, so that if I want to use that pedal for the sustain feature on the global preset, I can do that. So while I'm here, I'll just briefly mention that this global preset feature is perfect for unplanned moments or moments right after a song ends and you're unsure if you're going to build back up or not. Because when this is engaged, my timeline is set to pull up a bank that has a dotted eighth note delay on A and an eighth note delay on B. And then the big sky by default pulls up the biggest of three verbs I've set up on button C. But if we're building back into the song, I have two lesser reverb patches I can switch to if needed on buttons B and A. My HX Stomp is set to recall a basic preset that has either a bright EQ or a reverse delay, and the POG is queued up to fire a preset that adds a little filtered octave up and a little octave below. And then if I press the function button on my PBC, I can access the overdrives like an analog board. One last note is that I have my global preset set to absorb the tempo of whatever song I was coming from. So if I access the global preset from Praise You Anywhere, for example, it's going to set the delay time to 108 BPM. So again, this is really handy if you're using it to build back into a song or something like that. So I really like having this global preset, and it really helps keep this rig flexible, even though primarily I make presets for the vast majority of my songs. So next in my chain is the HX Stomp, and you've seen a few ways that I've used it already, but it's a pedal that I put on here because I already owned it, and even though I was really looking for something else, I couldn't find that something else yet. So I'm not hardly using this for much at all, just some EQ settings and the occasional modulation need or special effect. I've been experimenting with using it to transpose when I need to on the rare occasion, so I use it similarly to how I'd use the Digitech drop pedal, and it actually works reasonably well, especially coming after my overdrives. So in a pinch, it could work for that too. So I use the Stomp right now as kind of like a Swiss Army knife tool that I'll pull up if there's a sound I want but can't get from any of my other pedals, or if I need two modulation sounds at once, since the Mobius can't do that. really do like having the HX Stomp on the board. It's very flexible. Its MIDI implementation is great, but there could be something better out there for this purpose down the road. If you have suggestions, I'd love to hear them. Next up is the Stryfecta. There's not a ton I'll say here that hasn't been said, and you've been hearing them all along anyway. These three have been on boards everywhere for the last decade, and there's a ton of resources out there for these already. I will say, I used to get really detailed on patches and try to match the reverb and delay settings to the song I'm programming for as close as possible. And while I still do that on a lot of songs, more so I've been trying to build a library of more general sounds, kind of set at different tonal, mix, and decay settings that I can just easily recall that work with most songs. One thing I've noticed, especially having played through virtually every modeler and profiler out there, is that wet effects respond differently with each unit. And this is especially true when you run wet effects in front of the amps. How the delay and the reverb hit the front of the amp and make it break up in that unique way. Each modeler is different. So I usually have to tweak my presets whenever I make a change in my amp sim. So in this case, going to the ToneX from what I was using before, I definitely had to do some tweaking to the settings of my wet effects to get things to sound just right. And because of that, like I said, I've been developing a lot of my own standard go-to presets that fit the ToneX pedals specifically. And so at some point I'm planning on offering those on my website, so stay tuned for that. Now, I personally tend to add quite a bit of reverb and delay to my patches. Played by themselves, it might seem a little dramatic, but at least right now at my church, typically I'm the only electric player, so I find having a higher mix of verb and delay can actually allow my guitar to be able to be turned up louder in the mix while staying very full and filling the space nicely. Now, obviously you have to be careful with this, don't overuse it, but for me, I try to get the wet effects as loud as I can to fill out that space without being over the top. So hey, that just about wraps it up for this rig rundown. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, would you like it? And if you want to see more of this kind of stuff, subscribe to the channel to keep track of this tone journey and for all the other resources that are available here. If you have any questions about any of this at all or any comments, I would love to hear them. Drop me a comment. I will respond to it. I'll see it, and I'd be happy to chat with you about it. There are 2 more resources that I want to point you to. My favorite is my Instagram @TheToneShepherd, where I blend heart and craft together. As a full-time worship pastor with a love for Jesus and for gear, it's my true desire to help this community walk closer with Jesus, as well as push us to keep refining our craft. So my Instagram is full of biblical encouragement for your whole praise team, as well as guitar and some other production resources. If that sounds like something that would benefit you, you can follow me there. Now, secondly, you can also check out my website where you can follow my blog and check out a small store that has some Fractal FM9 resources, Strymon presets, ToneX captures, and probably some other stuff down the road. I really do appreciate you spending the time to check this out, and I hope that it was inspirational for you. I hope something you saw in this video or heard just inspired you to want to pursue creativity, especially creativity for the Lord's purposes and for the kingdom of God. If you play in a church setting, I just want to encourage you to keep chasing great tone and great creativity. We need just amazing music to inspire us and to welcome the presence of God into our hearts. It really does make a difference when people hear beautiful music connected to beautiful lyrics that allows them to enter the presence of God and to see Him differently and respond to Him differently. So all of this contributes to that end, and I hope this inspired you to keep pursuing that down the road. But truly, it was a pleasure having you watch this, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.